It is day 8 of Inktober 2024 and time for the 8th illustration out of the 31. Thank you very much for supporting the channel. It has been a great run for Inktober 2024 till date and we have a lot of more illustrations to come. So for today's illustration for the prompt hike, I'm making this whole scene where our protagonist, Nomad 31, has been faced with a challenge, a new challenge in fact. He has entered into this city known as Sector 13 and it has been reduced to rubble. There's almost nothing left in the city except a few skyscrapers and just a glimpse of its former glory. He has taken some high ground here and he's planning his route to cross this city. It's a time bomb at this point because there are still some embers burning and plumes of smoke rising in the distance, and it's only long before the enemies might attack very soon. I mean, you can never tell in such a scenario. So enjoy today's illustration, grab a cup of coffee, get your favorite snacks, and let's go. For today's podcast, the topic which I've chosen is scene setting. I'll be talking quite a bit about staging and the purpose behind your scene settings. These are two very important elements in illustration, and you'll get to know very soon why it is so. We have covered lighting in this podcast series, the use of negative space as an instrument for framing your illustrations and diverting the focus of the viewer towards the most important parts of the illustration and making the proportions correct and relatable, making the use of good reference images an integral part of your illustration procedure, having a good visual memory and creating a good visual library. We have talked about all these things. But today's topic, staging and the purpose of your illustrations, is on a very different level. Staging and purpose are two very often left out concepts by beginners when it comes to visual storytelling. I mean, just like I had mentioned for the use of negative spaces, these two things are a culmination of all the elements of your illustration and the decisions that you take in the making of your composition. So taking the example of this illustration, let me tell you more about the concept of staging. Staging, as the name suggests, is the process of establishing the different elements or characters of your scene in a particular manner. This is a step carried out way before you start the illustration process, in fact. I consider this to be one which starts in your mind, in your brain itself, due to the fact that it goes hand in hand with the purpose of your illustration. A quick deviation from the staging, let's talk about purpose for a bit. What is the purpose of your illustration that you are wanting to make? Ask this very simple question to yourself. What is the purpose? I ask this question to myself each time I'm just about to start an illustration. And the reason why I can confidently portray the scene as well as provide an explanation for why I did what I did during the illustration process is due to this step. For today's illustration, which we have at hand, the purpose was simple. I want my protagonist to be on a very, very difficult hike. Why is he going to hike inside a city? Well, it's a post-apocalyptic scenario, if you remember, which I've created for this Inktober series. And the city here, Sector 13, has been reduced to rubble. It's gonna be messy, and obviously the rubble from the skyscrapers, bridges and tall buildings, it is going to be quite huge in terms of the sheer size and scale as compared to a human being. I mean, imagine if a bridge collapses in real life. How big are the segments of a bridge? How big are the pillars supporting this bridge? It is not going to be easy to just walk past them. You have to cross, you have to hike through this scene. And since he has to cross this previously familiar but now difficult terrain, our protagonist has to take a high ground. He has to assess the extent of the damage that has unfolded after these wars, after these bombings, and he has to plan his route accordingly. Next comes the atmosphere. A war-stricken and post-apocalyptic world. What other elements do I want for portraying this atmosphere and making the concept believable and more anchored into reality? I need some ruined buildings in the distance, not much, because again, I don't want to make the illustration overcrowded and busy, because the foreground elements are going to be quite heavy in this one with all the rubble all around the scene. So I decided to draw this singular, tall, destroyed skyscraper which stands like a monolith in the center of the scene and has somehow managed to endure the bombings during the war. But it has been severely scarred, and so have some smaller buildings been around the vicinity, but they are not really that important elements of this illustration. If you were drawing a comic, a graphic novel or a manga, let's say, then this same scene could have been portrayed in different panels as slowly unfolding to reveal this final scene. However, in a single piece composition, you'll have to plan ahead, stage your elements and develop the story in your mind prior to the execution of the concept. I hope this illustration helps you understand the parallels that need to be considered during your scene setting process. Now, touching upon the topic of intensity and complexity for your scene setting. I've talked about complexity previously, and just like earlier, try to keep it within bounds. Keeping the focus on your story and using your skills to create the best interpretation as your first priority rather than the best looks is what matters. Intensity is a matter of conveying the extent of something. Had I just flattened the whole landscape here and reduced it to rubble, it would have created a striking imagery. You would have thought, okay, there used to be a city here and it has now been reduced to rubble completely. It has been flattened by a huge explosion or maybe by an earthquake, some kind of an apocalypse. And it would carry some intensity to it, right? But you, neither we don't know how this city looked before, right? This is not a comic book that I'm talking about. We don't know how this city used to look. I cannot make past image of this city in the same illustration. But what I can do is show you a glimpse of how it used to be. And that is the reason why instead of just flattening the whole landscape here, I considered the same fact and diluted the intensity a bit by choosing to show some remaining standing structures and portray the idea that, look, this is how tall and magnificent the city once stood before it was reduced to rubble. So again, it's a matter of conscious choices and prior planning. Now, in a scene setting, in portraying a scene, in portraying a story, the staging matters quite a lot. Why does it matter, you might ask, and why it is missed? Staging is not an easy concept to always consciously decide, especially when you are a beginner. And as a beginner, you might miss this step entirely. As you gain more and more experience, what you realize is you need to plan your illustrations in order to get the best result out of your efforts. And remember, your efforts are all culminating into this single illustration, into this single composition. So you need to be really careful about how you're portraying everything. I hope this video finds you well in your art journey and you are able to use these tips which I have just shared through this illustration process. I hope that by looking at this illustration, you are able to see all the different elements which you need to think about in a parallel fashion, in a contemporaneous fashion, in order to get the best results out of your efforts. Don't let your efforts go to waste by the end of your illustration, and don't let it become a busy mess. Frame your illustration properly. Use the concepts of negative space, because all these ideas are finally culminating into a single story. Now, if you are a visual storyteller, if you're writing mangas, if you're drawing comics, go ahead, plan as many panels as you want for a shot. I will talk about pacing later on, but I know that you can portray different scenes very well. But if you are planning on becoming a good illustrator who can make single picture compositions very easy to interpret, then keep these points in mind. I hope you are able to improve upon in your art journey very quickly using these tips, and I'll make sure to cover even more in the upcoming videos. I'll see you tomorrow. Till then, take care, be creative, and peace.